Public. So we're live.
Huzzah!
So we're still waiting for Scott to log back in, and a few people are having technical problems. Hopefully, by going on air, they'll be able to find us and log in. This is strategies for building workers' power, with discussion on co-ops. So, Matt, do you think there are some? What is this link you posted? Is this? Think there are some plugins people might need?
Can anybody hear Matt? I can't.
Did you hear me?
Yes. Sorry, I was muted. Yeah. There's some plugins. Google is pretty good about packaging for all operating systems, so they include Fedora and Ubuntu plugins as well as traditional non-free operating systems.
Okay, I just checked. Anybody that goes to Matthew's page can click on the on-air link.
Okay.
And bring up a new page where you see like a YouTube video. When you click play, it will show the live broadcast. They're not actually joining in the conversation, but they will be able to view the live broadcast.
Cool. I think I see what's her issue getting in. She hasn't actually set up a Google Plus profile yet.
Oh, you have to set up a Google Plus profile?
Mm-hmm. In order to participate in Hangouts that are more than just one-on-one video chats, you need to have one, so you can just...
Favor, if y'all gonna type, please mute your mic.
Okay, yeah. I was just responding to...
At least I know something's happening. I thought we weren't going to have technical problems, but I don't know. What do you think? What do we want to do?
I mean, what I would do is what was it Steve suggested? Was posting the link to your profile so people can at least view, even if they can't be part of the conversation. Because that would, for people who haven't set up Google Plus accounts, that would probably be the easiest thing, rather than going through the whole process of setting up a new Plus account.
So my profile, it's possible to link people directly to my Google Plus profile.
Yes, I think that you should be able to do that. Okay, so it looks like this Stephanie is going through is going to be setting up the Google Plus profile. She should be able to come in this moment.
And let's remember, this will be posted to YouTube, so everything we're saying and recording right now, people can watch later.
Right. That's all good.
Wait, hey, can anyone hear me?
Yep.
Oh, good. Because if it's the YouTube video, people could be able to communicate via the comment section. If we post the YouTube link, and then people could post comments on it, that might be useful.
Right. For that.
Which then I'd be willing to moderate the I'd be willing to do the comment section. I could like monitor the comments and bring those up as if there are any interesting ones that might be fun to see. I could I've got YouTube. I could open it up. Just hopefully that'll work.
It's not actually posted to YouTube until after.
No. Yes, it is. You can watch the live broadcast. I've seen live broadcast. I've watched live broadcasts on YouTube of things like this before. Just not sure it'll be on. Matt, check your Matt. Check to see the link to the YouTube videos, since I've seen live broadcasts before.
Okay, I'm trying to invite people.
Matt, in the group chat, I just put the link to the YouTube video.
Okay.
Maybe wait. Is it possible to create an event chat, like a chat for everyone who's going to the event?
There's a questions and answers part you can open.
Oh, there is?
Yeah, there's a Q&A. I clicked Q&A and that created a little a sidebar on the right. You should be able to type things.
I think, why don't we just go ahead and start the presentations? We know it's going to be on YouTube, so we can send people there. We don't want to have too much chat beforehand, or else people just won't hang around.
Yeah.
Right. Okay. Well, hopefully Scott will get back on. He was on earlier. He's calling in from Brazil, so you may have connection problems. He even said he had power problems before, so who knows, maybe his power went out. So this is strategies for building workers' power. It's the idea for doing a Google Hangout like this came out of a phone conference where the conversation just kind of came up, and we talked about unions as well as co-ops as different strategies, so Revolutionary Unity is an organization of people from all over the U.S. and even other parts of the world. Scott, for example, in Brazil, as well as we have a few people in one or two people in Canada and Scotland as well. So we try to stay in touch online and use these technologies to be more dynamic, even as a small organization, and have hopefully interesting conversations at the least, and connect with other people who are doing interesting things. So I guess as we have conversations, especially as people log on, if there are any ambient noises, just know that you can mute yourself unless you have something to say, and that might make the call a little bit clearer for everyone else. And you should be able to call in as well, which means we won't be able to see you, but if you can call in to my Google Voice number, which is 802-858-6466. So we had set up to have two speakers. Scott Wallace, who I mentioned earlier, is in Brazil, working to build a co-op around agricultural technologies down there. He's originally from the United States. He was in Florida for a little while, where he met up with folks who are now members of Revolutionary Unity. So that's how we're connected with him. And our other speaker is here with us right now, Matt Cropp, and he's with Cooperative Vermont. So I'm in Vermont as well, so that's how I know Matt through some of his activities here, and I'm sure he can talk more about that. So what we'll do, I think, is give Matt 15 minutes to kind of talk about what he's doing or what his thoughts are around co-ops, how they can benefit people in the here and now, and how it may relate to strategy for transforming society to something more equitable than what we have now. We can do, I guess, with this number of people, we can have a fairly informal conversation after that.
Cool. Well, hopefully everyone can hear me well, and thank you for having me. So I was thinking about this presentation a little bit earlier today, and I figured I would start just because from what I was reading about your group, people are probably coming at this from a variety of angles. So I figured the best place to start would be kind of the premise that I'm working off, and everything that I'm going to discuss sort of follows from that. So I'll copy and paste that both into the little chat sidebar, sort of the little couple sentences that I wrote up, and then just sort of talk about it, and then I'll kind of get into some stuff following that. But so the basic premise is when their behavior accurately reflects the core values of their movement, co-ops can be understood as the institutional embodiment of an economic order that puts empowered human beings at the center of economic life, as opposed to investor-owned corporations in which the distribution of power is determined by the extent of one's capital ownership, not the reality of one's personhood. Given this, activists working towards the realization of a humanized economy can advance that goal through supporting the co-op movement in two ways. So, we can, if we want to get into a discussion later about, whether co-ops are the embodiment of this, that's, I think, an important discussion. But my underlying premise is that these are a really useful tool for advancing the agenda of kind of a humanized economy. But the two major ways I can see sort of activists engaging with the cooperative movement is one, by supporting the expansion of co-ops, essentially engaging in boosterism, but in a number of ways. And then the second one is in which there's a lot of there can be quite a bit of conflict, but is also extremely important, is what I would refer to as bulldogging cooperative values. So to start with, like the perhaps less controversial, less intense piece is, to move. The goal of moving from, I've heard it described as right now we have these little islands of cooperation, these little islands of mutuality in this great sea of capitalism, and ideally, the goal is to reverse that, have cooperation be the dominant institution, the dominant model for economic life, and have maybe these little puddles of capitalism here and there that maybe have their roles. We can debate that. So if the goal is to sort of take the economy and go from this capitalism to this kind of like cooperatively based economic order, there's a number of things we can, as like engaged activists, that we can do to advance this goal. Kind of the first and sort of easiest, or it seems easy but is also very important, is simply raising awareness of the cooperative model. Something that in my time as like an activist within the co-op movement that I've really encountered is how strongly the roles of employee and customer are socialized into people. From the very earliest time, you go into the grocery store as a small child, you get a sense that there's this oppositional relationship, and people carry, well, even if they're sort of engaged with cooperatives as institutions, they carry that socialization with them. So even if you're in a food co-op where you have an ownership stake, you still will often behave like a customer, because that's the sort of dominant, in an oppositional way, that's the dominant mode of relations. In the same way, like someone at a worker co-op might find themselves sort of behaving like an employee, despite the fact that they have legitimate stake in and control of the enterprise, because that is the dominant way of approaching institutions in our society. So so then it becomes really important to kind of point out, okay, what is this alternative identity that people can have in relating to these co-ops? And once people sort of start to get that, it really changes the way that they relate to them, and it makes someone who identifies as a member rather than a customer really has a lot more loyalty and a lot more of an interest in actually advancing the interests of the institution. A second strategy for kind of this growing the size of the co-op economy is sort of supporting consumer migrations. An obvious example of that being something like Bank Transfer Day, which happened kind of at the height of the Occupy movement's activity in 2011. And that, it's sort of a first step for a lot of people, where it's an individualized consumer action. It in and of itself isn't going to transform the world, but it's an opportunity to get people to start thinking about, okay, how are the institutions that I interact with currently structured? How little power as the person do I really have in there? And here's this potential alternative that that is based on democracy, economic democracy, and you can have potentially realize a lot more power. So it's on one hand, just a way of potentially trying to siphon or divert a flow of resources from the capitalist economy into the cooperative economy. But it's also a chance for kind of consciousness-raising activities to get people to think about their relationships and how power is distributed and stuff like that. And so there's actually a group of us who are trying to organize some direct actions at Too Big to Fail banks for this November 5th to do exactly that. A third piece is supporting startup cooperatives. The process of organizing a startup cooperative is very volunteer, labor intensive. One that I've particularly been following closely is actually in Vermont, in Matt Andrews' neighborhood, the Granite City Grocery, which is this kind of poor, working class granite mine or quarrying community in central Vermont that has no downtown grocery store. So for the past year, people have been kind of really putting energy into building a broad community consensus that a food co-op downtown would be both desirable, but also sort of equitable and would treat low-income members of the community in a fair way. But that sort of process of going around collecting pledges from hundreds of people, getting buy-in from all sorts of different social groups to form a coalition that can form a co-op is a lot of work, but also a really great opportunity to really connect with elements of the community that oftentimes radical activists especially don't really connect with, because it's this broader community project. Fourth piece of this first first of two ways of engaging in the cooperative movement for activists is sort of adding muscle to political fights. When going up against the interests of corporate America, the corporations always have massive piles of money to influence the political process. But if properly mobilized, co-ops have the possibility of saying, all right, we have tens or hundreds of millions of members who maybe they don't have money, but in our political system in reality, if they recognize their sense of ownership, they can be organized into a fairly powerful political force. And so I think it's something where activists can kind of come in and be the ones who, when these political fights come up in which it becomes the cooperative economy versus the corporate economy, then there's a chance. And an example right now of that going on is in sort of all the fights over the budget, the American Bankers Association is really pushing a strategy for Congress to help balance the budget by levying extra taxes on credit unions, which the credit unions then have been sort of pushing back on. And it's an interesting moment for potentially mobilizing grassroots support from cooperators. And then finally, it's supporting the expansion of co-ops is within your co-ops, anything that you're involved with, supporting what I would refer to as a strong interpretation of Principle 6. There's which is the cooperative principles, the Rockdale principles that go back to the 1840s. But Principle 6 is the one that calls for cooperation between cooperatives. And there's a tendency among sort of the conservative wing of the cooperative movement to simply interpret that as, okay, well, maybe like your cooperative should join a trade association. So like the credit union joins the state credit union association, and there it's it's to fulfill that principle. But a strong interpretation of this principle basically calls for the co-op to actively support the growth of new co-ops in the cooperative movement. So providing mentoring to new co-op startups, providing capital. My food co-op has put a pretty substantial, over the years, amount of the capital it's accumulated into helping kind of fund through low interest loans the creation of other food co-ops and other cooperative projects. So really sort of nudging our co-ops towards this kind of idea of they're not just they're not just these little isolated islands of cooperation, but they're there to gradually expand this thing into a continent. Now the second piece of this that I think is sort of perhaps the first piece of just kind of boosting and sort of helping grow this cooperative economy is an important thing, but it's something I think that can be done sort of in this more broad way. Whereas the second piece that I think is really important for people who are conscious activists to be aware of and doing is this kind of idea of bulldogging cooperative values. Because there are a lot of co-ops. I think it's estimated that 300-something million co-op memberships in the United States. There are all these organizations, many of which stretch back a long ways. But the difference between the stated values of valuing democracy and all this stuff and the actual sort of way they operate, there can be some that have quite a huge gulf between the principles and the reality. And there's a number of reasons for this, and it's particularly pronounced in kind of consumer co-ops as opposed to worker co-ops. Because consumer co-ops are, the level of individual sort of investment is much lower. You spend 8 hours a day in your workplace, you're going to be invested in governance and all that. Whereas if you're like, okay, well, I've got one annual meeting a year and I go use the credit union, there's a tendency for members to become disengaged unless the institution actively promotes democratic participation. And so there's a guy who's the recently retired general manager of the Washington Electric Co-op in Vermont, who I was having a conversation with, and he framed this kind of decay of democratic practice in co-ops as like the 30-year rule. You have this founding generation who see the need for the co-op. It was oftentimes founded in a time of crisis or time where there's this need that was not being met, and so a lot of people have this real sense of mission to it. But after they go through their professional life cycle and they kind of move out of age out of the movement, there's often trouble with kind of the next generation, which doesn't have that same sense of experienced history in terms of getting in terms of their attachment to it. And what kind of can fill the void of that energy that had been there and sort of decayed is what can be referred to as management capture. So the management of an organization, and co-ops are just one example of this, kind of has an incentive to, officially the members supposedly elect the board, and the board sort of sets policy, and management, supposedly representing the members, and then management, then follows the board. What can happen is that power relationship can be inverted, and the agenda starts being set not by the members and being expressed through the board, but instead by management, and management can gradually sort of gain control of the board. And the management of the organization's interests are very different often from the interests of the rank-and-file members. This has been a huge problem in recent years within the credit union movement especially, as it's become professionalized. And managers, and you've seen this rapid consolidation of the movement into bigger and bigger organizations, partially because a manager gets paid a lot more if they're in charge of a billion-dollar credit union than a $100 million credit union. And so, even if it's not necessarily in the interest of the average members to grow, they will push growth anyway because it benefits them personally. And that's been taken to its logical conclusion a few times, where credit unions have actually demutualized, so ceased to be cooperatives, where the board and the management realize that if they can, if there's a disengaged membership and they can push through a motion to become a first a mutual savings bank and then a mutual savings bank, commercial savings bank, that's kind of the legal path that they have to follow to do this. If they can sort of push that through, they can stand to make hundreds of thousands of dollars each from their new roles. So it's essentially taking a cooperative sort of pool of wealth that's been built up over generations and just looting it. So we've seen this happen a few times, and a few of them have been defeated by members getting actively involved, but that's sort of like an extreme case where finally the members realize that if they're not going to stand up, the resource is going to be lost completely to the capitalist economy. So then the question becomes, okay, so you have a lot of these co-ops with huge amounts of resources. The credit union movement has about $1 trillion in deposits sitting in there. So how do we move this from something that's, at best kind of sitting passively, and at worst something that's decaying into the cooperative economy? Sort of one of the biggest things that I advocate and have been actively participating in myself is the formation of dissident groups within existing co-ops. This is something where you see it from time to time. The Washington Electric Co-op in Vermont had a number of fights to go on, and they actually have kind of probably some of the most renewables in their portfolio now of any energy portfolio of any electric co-op in the country, because specifically there's this kind of elite clique that was overturned by a group of activists they first challenged them in the 70s and 80s, and then the second round, and actually Avram Pat, who I mentioned earlier, who eventually became the general manager, came to that position not because he was a professional in electrical engineering, but because he was on the board for 8 years as part of this dissident faction and kind of had the administrative skills to really sort of implement a lot of what this kind of dissident board that actually took control of the whole co-op wanted to get enacted. And I've been part of a group that at Vermont Federal Credit Union has been challenging a group that there hadn't been a competitive election in living memory, and it's a pretty classic case of management capture. So we've got one person on the board, and they've resisted very strongly, but we're continuing to sort of, and it's a long game, it's been several years so far, but we're continuing to kind of move the pieces into place to hopefully eventually have a majority on the board of the credit union with close to $400 million in assets. And so the question, but of how to so when forming these this group to sort of challenge the hegemony of these sort of conservative ruling cliques within co-ops, thinking of where those people who actually sort of form that challenge come from. The first would obviously be activist alliances. Within Washington Electric Co-op, it was a lot of kind of back to the landers in the 70s and like environmental activists specifically who are going and saying we want the co-op to enact a green energy policy. And in Vermont Federal, it sort of initially grew out of a group that we all met each other through Occupy Burlington. A second group that I think that hasn't really been brought in as of yet, but I think is ripe for that, would be worker co-op members. Because as I mentioned before, worker co-ops tend to have the strongest sense of cooperative identity because it's the biggest part of someone's life, their work time, and so, but it's also the most capital-starved sector of the cooperative movement. And so I think that there's kind of a quid pro quo that could be organized in which worker co-ops, the members of worker co-ops could sort of become part of a coalition that moves in to sort of radicalize essentially these existing conservative co-ops, particularly credit unions, and as part of the goal being to turn it around so the credit unions can start becoming a source of capital for actively building the cooperative movement, providing capital to worker co-ops, providing capital to new consumer co-op startups, etc. That again, there's like $1 trillion in assets sitting there, and if that can start being funneled, at least small portions of it, at least into the cooperative economy, which is extremely capital starved, that could be a huge burst of growth. And then thinking about kind of who you're going up against in these fights is management, obviously. The board that kind of is in alliance with management, and you'll have the board's kind of immediate connections. They're friends who are members of the credit union, and then management will often, in the case of Vermont Federal, they actually kind of intimidated the employees in coming and voting as a block with them. So literally, there were a group of employees and their supervisor sitting right behind them, and it was expected that they vote with management. Now, but still, that's not an enormous, insurmountable block. It's not, and in the Vermont Federal case, we found that when there was a large annual meeting with a lot of members who were coming for the first time, when we to challenge challenge sort of some of the practices of the board, it passed by a 2-to-1 margin. So these ruling groups don't actually have a substantial support base within the membership. So kind of these activists coming in and organizing can really have a potential to actually sort of build more power than the ruling group. And in terms of the employee piece, an obvious place to kind of create a fissure would be management and kind of middle management will be expected to support them. But if you've got maybe a union drive going on within the lower level employees and they see this dissident group is favorable to the union, then you could potentially even pull them over to the other side. But then the question, okay, so you've got your coalition, take power in your credit union and your food co-op, etc. So what is it that you should do with that power? And there's a few things that we're proposing, and this is, I think, these are essentially these organizations that can be a source of a lot of resources for movement building and experiences with actual democratic self-governance in the economic sphere that can be a huge teaching opportunity for people who are newly activated members. But there's a few other things that are specifically around the idea that, especially in these bigger consumer co-ops, democracy is only going to work if the co-op actively invests in democracy. And the sort of incentive for management in the management capture scenario is that they'll underinvest in democracy, people become less engaged, and so there's nothing to hold management accountable. So really sort of the key sort of first level of demands, I guess you could say, would be things like democratized community giving. So rather than the board being able to hand out patronage to local well-connected nonprofits, you give every member an equal vote in where community giving money goes, which means that all sorts of small radical projects could get actual institutional support from cooperatives. A second one, and at the same time giving everyone a sense of, oh, this is, I'm participating in this community patronage that's happening. I own that, and I own that becomes, an understanding of I own this organization. This is not alienated from me. The second one is the idea of kind of creating accessible democratic spaces. So having the annual meeting be something where it's an accessible time, maybe on the weekend. There's a meal provided, maybe entertainment provided, there's childcare provided, so that someone's a single parent, that the process is still accessible to them. Maybe transportation's even provided. If you have a credit union, maybe there's a bus from each branch that goes to the annual meeting, so that people who don't have cars can participate in governance too. Really sort of making it this open experience for people to actually, in meaningful space where real decisions are happening, real democracy is happening, and all these people who are kind of right now passive members of cooperatives can actually learn to practice democracy in this field. And hey, if I'm able to run my financial institution, and where I get my food, why isn't the rest of my economic life structured in this way that takes my participation in humanity into account? And then the third piece, this is very much around kind of breaking the hegemony of these kind of self-perpetuating elites in a lot of co-ops, is to make the democratic process more accessible. So a key piece of that is something that they did at the Washington Electric Co-op when they took power, which is eliminating nominating committees, which act as essentially gatekeepers to ballot access. And especially in credit unions, the alternative to getting the nominating committee, which is, determined by the board, which if the board doesn't want any challenge, it'll just renominate itself and nominate no one else and have uncompetitive elections, is to collect hundreds of signatures from members, which is actually a pretty difficult process since, a lot of people rarely go into branches, and how do you find 400 members? So it's doable, we've done it, but it's very difficult. So replacing that with something that would be like a committee on candidates, which anyone who wants to run, they simply go, give their credentials to show that they're a member in good standing, and their name's added to the ballot. So kind of opening that democracy so that people who want to be who initially want to be engaged can participate, but also sort of making it so that you have a positive feedback loop of people who had previously been passive members starting to see the co-op as a place to get economic empowerment and a school of democracy and a place to learn these skills that we aren't taught because, again, we're socialized into these roles of customer and employee. And to come out of it as not just a credit union member, but now as a cooperator who wants to see this whole thing continuing to expand. So this is kind of why I think that there's this huge cooperative sector that there's in many nooks and crannies very limited democracy right now, and I think that especially given how the state has been increasingly captured by corporate interests. This is the cooperative movement is a place where energy can really go, that is directly building a humanized economy that is meeting people's needs like now, but is also sort of creating these preconditions and these opportunities for learning and practicing self-governance that can be then sort of expanded over time. So yeah, I would encourage everyone who's involved here to look at the co-ops that exist in your community and really see if there are you can find opportunities for getting involved and really pushing them in a radical direction. So that's my spiel.
Excellent. Well, thank you. Does anybody else have comments or questions?
Hey Matt, I wanted to ask you: are co-ops governed by state or federal law?
It depends on a number of things. Actually, for like credit unions, most states have actually both state and federal charter legislation, so they can be. There are some credit unions, say in Vermont, that are state chartered, and there are others that are federal chartered. So it's really dependent. Like oftentimes you have to look specifically at the specific organization because you have a dual set of laws that can go either way.
Isn't there a certain level of danger for especially I remember reading about the Mondragon cooperative where they were actually you had like they were actually organizing there was union busting going on in like Poland, which had a level of racism going on, of anti-Polish racism going on between the people who worked in the cooperative in I think it's Basque country and then other places where there was a struggle where you had, or even Sisters Camelot. There's I've been following that because I get the industrial workers, and the IIW is unionizing a certain part of this supposedly radical thing where the workers unionized, and there was a pretty brutal ongoing and relatively brutal campaign against the members who were organized with the IIW.
So I think that the way that co-ops exist, they're not perfect ideal institutions. They always exist within the sort of context that of the community around them, and there's also like a particularly attention and continuing to work on like how all the interests of the different participants come into play. So I think that an interesting example of this is the food co-op movement right now, because you have these, like how do you mediate the interests of the workers and the consumers? Because like in my day job, I'm a social worker, and I work with people who are like, yeah, I can't afford to go to the food co-op to get food. I'll go to Price Chopper because I can get 99-cent packets of ham, and they pay their workers less, but this person's on disability and has $3.54 to eat for the week. So the question of, okay, how do you mediate the interest between workers who want to sort of maximize their wages, even if it, say, hurts the most economically marginalized people in the community, but the consumers who want to have the cheapest food possible, even if it leads to workers working on starvation wages. And there are different ways that co-ops have tried to mediate that. Probably one of the more common in Vermont, we have a couple of co-ops that are unionized, so that you kind of have two interests sitting at the table for trying to find a balance. The UE, they're unionized through the UE. And then you also have a few co-ops that are experimenting with as essentially being hybrid food co-ops, where you have equal ownership stakes being given to workers and consumers. And some of the early food co-ops also essentially had something where you'd have the consumer members and then a collective, like a workers' collective. And so the relationship of the co-op would be essentially the consumer members all formed a buying club, and the workers' collective basically provided the labor to run sort of the central storehouse of that buyers' club. So, it's a sort of thing where even within the world of cooperatives, there's going to be tension between different kind of constituent groups, and there's continued work that needs to be done on figuring out what are the most just ways of mediating those conflicting interests.
But I mean, yeah, but isn't there like a danger that you could have cooperatives just become there's a, I don't know, there's an article, I can't remember if it, probably there's this concept of self-managing your own exploitation, where you end up where you work you end up cutting your own hours and stuff and cutting your own pay because you're essentially a capitalist, and you end up being just as screwed as an average worker, but because you're within the capitalist framework, which is a totalitarian framework, you have to enforce on yourself the same punishment that someone else that you would have to do if you were employed, but you can't fight back because it's you.
Well, I think if I interpret what you're saying correctly, so the idea basically that co-ops exist within the larger capitalist market economy and have to accommodate themselves to the realities of that, and stay solvent and stuff like that.
Yeah, basically.
Yeah. So it's again the sort of thing where at the moment you're not going to see co-ops as these entirely utopian kind of worlds, but what they do, what the benefit is one, again, we have these small, the metaphor of the small islands of cooperation in the great ocean of capitalism. That you can start. It's a space where you can start to build smaller kind of relationships that don't rely on that the dynamics of the relationship or the kind of capitalist relations, and hopefully gradually expand them, while also sort of support that expansion. But of course, because it's not utopian, it's in the nitty-gritty here and now, actually meeting needs. There's always going to have to be these compromises that are made depending on the specific situation. But so one of the benefits, again, I think that's really important I really need to feel like I should emphasize this, is that the organizations offer these spaces where people can learn self-governance and collective governance, and how to participate in a way in which they, they have a voice in economic affairs, and that experience itself is a hugely useful one in that it sort of flips people's relationship from one in which they see this kind of oppositional way of being as the default way of being and as a naturalized way of being, into something where they can question it and sort of point to experiences of, hey, like I had to say, I was able to stand up at the annual meeting of my food co-op and say, I think this policy is bullshit, I'd like to see it changed, and if they have a good point and a number of other members agree with them, they can use that process to actually have their voice heard, even if they have, whereas very few economic resources. Whereas if, they're at a conventional grocery store, unless they've got a pile of stock, like the worst they can do is move their patronage to a different grocery store. And so the kind of experience of that sort of empowerment, I think, in the creation of as many of those experiences of empowerment as possible, are something that can kind of create a lot of potential in other fields and can be sort of a virtuous cycle of empowerment, demanding more power, questioning why you don't have that power in most of your life, and rinse and repeat.
I think that one thing that I don't have I have a view of cooperatives that's more nuanced than a lot of people, or not nuanced. I hate when people say nuanced, where they actually mean that they want to. But whatever. My view of cooperatives in a lot of ways is that they can be powerful, but only as part of larger movements. Like when there's large social movements going on, cooperatives can be powerful. Especially you have in Greece, you have these creations of what are called social clinics, which Greece is, and they're much more effective than they are here because Greece is in a very different position in the class struggle. The Greece's position in the class struggle is powerful enough that these social clinics can be supported by a mass movement, so that this relationship you have is different from something. Where if you set up one cooperative here with a bunch of people, it's different. Like I think it depends a lot on the state of the generalized class struggle. Sorry, that make any sense?
Well, it's one of those things where you look at the history of cooperatives and you see these bursts of growth during times of economic crisis. So it's like, so I think to a certain extent there's a cyclical kind of pattern, and I think and the way I like to think about it is that sort of you have this continuous cooperative movement that exists in good times and in bad. And in good times, sort of a strategy in relatively good economic times when the whole pie is growing, cooperatives can kind of be accommodating, in that they sort of, if the whole pie is growing, well, the cooperative can say, all right, well, my piece is getting a little bit bigger, my piece is getting a little bit bigger, and there really isn't the social movement energy to challenge this. But in times of crisis, when the pie goes from growing to shrinking, that's a moment of opportunity, I think, for co-ops to move from kind of a more business orientation to a more social movement orientation. Yeah, where the pie is shrinking and their membership, the members, and you have this this huge population of members who are not mobilized, who are not conscious of their role at the moment, just sort of see this as, hey, here's another business I happen to use. But if members can be mobilized in that moment, not only can the size of that pie as the pie is shrinking be defended quite effectively, but it can be actually expanded through that sort of action. And so you can see this, I think, as a strategy that is a long-term strategy. That this is a journey as cooperatives weren't invented yesterday. This is a journey we've been on for 150 years, and that kind of making sure that social movements are ready to engage and really sort of throw their weight around for cooperatives and in cooperatives, in those moments of crisis, I think is a pretty vital thing.
I wanted to ask Matt about, you talked a lot about the strategies for building a co-op movement, and it always seemed kind of odd to me that the cooperative movement, at least from my perspective, maybe it's just what I see, but there's a real focus on food, which I think for social reasons makes a lot of sense around providing healthy food, food that might not otherwise be accessible to people. But as an economic model, I think there are a lot of problems with food co-ops because you're basically just a retailer that's reselling other products from other companies. So you can only mark up. There really isn't a lot of labor value added through labor in that kind of a co-op. Your workers are unloading a truck and they're putting the product on the shelves, but you can only mark up that product so much, and oftentimes if you are providing things that are organic or GMO-free, that are just produced on a smaller scale because they're local and done in a more socially conscious manner, those prices are higher, and there isn't a lot of room for workers to have decent wages. It seems to me that co-ops, the real advantage, at least if you have a workplace where there is a lot of surplus value, there would be more maneuverability to pay people good wages or to put income towards other purposes, socially conscious purposes. And if I understood you correctly, it sounded like you were talking about credit unions as being at least one place maybe for the movement to start in terms of building financial support for other cooperatives as kind of as a launching pad. And it seems kind of, I don't know, it's kind of daunting. It's like, I don't know anything about banking, and you probably need a lot of money to get started in the first place. And the people who are most interested in that are probably least likely to have like altruistic values. So could you talk a little more about maybe seeing that strategy of building the, like, do you see credit unions is playing that role? Is it really possible for us to do that, or is it all about like trying to recapture the ones that already exist?
So there's a few pieces. The first thing, just on the food co-op thing briefly. So food co-ops have seen like several waves of kind of being started, and I think one of the reasons why they're seen as like the food co-ops is kind of being at the sort of most visible piece of the cooperative movement, is because we're sort of there's this wave of them in the 70s that really came out of the New Left, and sort of this kind of sort of middle class lefty desire for like Whole Foods, you know, the kind of classic stereotypes of and patchouli and all that that goes along with it. And that's actually been a pretty, for instance, the Granite City Grocery Co-op that's organizing in Barrie, that's been a history that they've had to sort of come to terms with, because a lot of the low-income people who they're organizing were very skeptical of the idea until sort of they kind of wrap their head around, okay, it's not about getting you know, necessarily these expensive foods, but it's about, you know, making sure that that groceries are accessible in the community, and, you know, it can reflect your values. But yeah, like sort of food co-ops are a place where there's a lot of energy that goes into, especially like kind of activist energy relative to the whole co-op movement. But economically, it's much more marginal than sort of some of the places where there's really a lot of resources and capital and potential power, which I would say would be credit unions, electric co-ops in rural areas. You know, it's something
literal
like
power.
And sort of to a certain extent agricultural co-ops, although that's kind of a special case. But in terms of credit unions, so basically what's happened has been since 1969. All the growth in the credit union movement has been what we could refer to as sort of intensive rather than extensive. Up until 1969, credit unions expanded by there being more credit unions. After 1969, the number of institutions has steadily declined while the assets and members has expanded. So we've been having fewer credit unions that are larger. And so what that's kind of meant, and at the same time, management is professionalized, the staff is professionalized. We used to have them essentially run by volunteers or people who are kind of like half volunteering, half, you know, they maybe get a small stipend, but they mostly did it because they kind of cared about their community and were like, hey, I want to, do this and help out. My grandfather was one of those people like back in the 50s and 60s. And but but what's happened with the with this expansion is that it's come part and parcel of this kind of collapse in democratic participation. You have larger institutions with less member engagement, and so sort of starting credit unions, given this historic trend, I think is the wrong strategy, because essentially you're having to kind of reinvent the wheel, and have to go through all these piles of all sorts of like bureaucratic issues, regulatory issues, et cetera, et cetera. Whereas you basically have these things where the democratic culture has decayed to the point where a relatively you wouldn't need a huge number of people to walk into, if you're consistently organizing, to go into sort of pick a credit union in your area and to sort of start getting involved in the governance, and then sort of move control of what is this huge pile of assets that, because of the member disengagement, has become functionally owned by, not fully owned by, but controlled by management, and sort of move control back into sort of the people as a whole. And because these institutions now have like broad bases, like in Vermont, the VSCCU, anyone who lives in the state of Vermont can join it. It has 500 something million in assets. That these then you can sort of make the argument to these institutions that, hey, that cooperative principle 6, let's make sure that we put 1% of our assets should be maybe out on principle, like out on loans to support new co-ops starting, existing co-ops expanding, providing working capital to worker co-ops. Maybe the existing institution should provide mentorships to people who want to start new co-ops. Really, kind of like putting the cooperative identity back on the agenda for these organizations, and finding other ways again to sort of make it so that the organizations can really provide a basis for other projects and for social movements, both in terms of funding, in terms of organizing, and even just like in terms of creating spaces that are open for organizing to happen. So the members aren't all alienated from each other and only, their only connection to credit unions, and they have to have the logo on their ATM card, but that, you start running into people and be like, oh, you're a member of the same, we're a member of the same cooperative. Oh, we saw each other at the big annual meeting and had dinner next to each other, and had conversations about not only the cooperative but the other things that are going on in our world and what we need to do about it.
I was an employee at a member-owned co-op for a while, food co-op, and ran for the board of directors. My experience was, it was, as you say, the management pretty much ran the business, and the board that they had pretty much just rubber stamped whatever management wanted, and it was run on the basis of low wages, and really hiring people who could be easily exploited. And the election process, there were something like 7 or 8, I think it was like 7 people running for 6 seats, and I was like maybe there might have been 1 or 2 other people actually campaigning in any meaningful way to be on the board. So it seemed like, and I was the only employee running, so it seemed like I had a pretty good chance. But the way the elections worked, they allowed people just to come in, fill out a ballot, and drop it in a ballot box at the store. So they invited anybody who wanted to come and watch them count the ballots, but there was really no way that. I think that it would have been very easy for management to either coordinate getting people to come in to vote, asking people to come in to vote, to keep me off, or to even just blatantly go in and stuff the ballot box with votes, because they basically held the ballot box. And I think they were well aware. I was pretty open about my politics as a candidate. for the board. Um, so I just felt like it was a kind of thing where democracy was so corrupt that I mean I had a handful of supporters, co-op members as well as workers, but short of really, it's at that point it seems like the levers of democracy wouldn't even work. The only way to get any change might be to just try to shame management, but people were really hesitant to believe that there could be anything wrong with their co-op. I think a lot of these co-op consumers are kind of buy into this idea that, well, it's a small business and it's local, so doesn't that mean that it's all, doesn't that mean that it's all these wonderful things, and how can that be bad?
Mm-hmm.
I think it's not just that people are misinformed and don't realize that co-ops have degenerated and become just like regular businesses, but like there's a real emotional investment. Like every time they go to shop there's like this emotional investment. They're like, well, I'm spending extra money, but it's because I love my co-op.
Mm-hmm. And I mean, like, I think that one of the in the experience we've had with Vermont Federal Credit Union, it's been sort of this long process of essentially giving management and the incumbent board the rope with which to hang themselves, so to speak. So it's been, we started off acting in good faith, like assuming that, City Market in Burlington, our food co-op, has pretty democratic elections. There's usually, at least twice as many candidates as there are seats, and you pretty much just go to the board and they're like, hey, can I get on the ballot? And you're on the ballot, and you can give a little speech at the annual meeting. And so we sort of went into the credit union, blissfully assuming that would be the case. And so they put out a notice saying you needed 20 signatures from members to get on the ballot. So we're like, oh, cool, we'll go collect the signatures. Unfortunately, we made the classic rookie mistake of saying that we were going to do this, which gave them the opportunity to look at the bylaws and realize, oh, it's not 20 signatures, it's 1% of the membership. So suddenly, now we have to collect 330 signatures, and then they went through, when we collected them, spent 20, 30 hours collecting signatures in front of branches. They went through line by line, anyone who happened to be like a joint holder on the account, so there's legally only one of the holders on the account is a member, so they can sign, crossed all those people out. So we got 2 of our candidates disqualified by, essentially quibbling over signatures.
Wow.
And then, once we got there, we had a supporter who we actually met in the Occupy Burlington encampment, who worked as like kind of a low-level clerk who was feeding us information, and he was able to sort of essentially tell us like they had retreat the night before. They basically had a presentation in which management was very careful about what they said to the employees. We said, well, all the candidates who have been chosen by the nominating committee are well qualified, but anyone can get on the ballot from just collecting signatures. So the implication being that basically the expectation was the vote was going to be against, or that if you're an employee who cares about the organization, you vote against the dissident faction. And then there was also something where they actually, one of the board members who'd been on there for like a very long time actually passed away, and they didn't reveal that she had passed away for several weeks. And then when they did, they said that they were going to hold her seat out of the election, and then the board was going to vote on who filled it after the election. Which at the 11th hour, the regulator had to step in and say, no, you can't run an election like that. So, but otherwise, that would have allowed them to make it so it couldn't even take one seat, which fortunately the NCUA was able to intervene, and so now Eric Davis is on the board of Vermont Federal. But they essentially were willing to break the rules in order to maintain power, and I think it's the sort of thing where that kind of apathy or that sort of sense of trust that you recognized, the best, it's a long process, but the best way to really sort of lay that out is to sort of try to use the process and be very clear about documenting every time, okay, because the democratic process is what legitimates their leadership. The co-op is better because it's democratic. Well, let's test that. Let's use these democratic things that you say are in existence, and I should have access to, and let's see how they actually work. And as those things, as you go through the process and they expose themselves as as they care more about holding on to power than they do about actually sort of protecting democracy, you have the shift in legitimacy. And that was something where, so that was the first annual meeting at Vermont Federal. The second one that we had, they put out at least a notice saying, offering people, which they had never done before, saying, hey, would you like to put in an application to the nominating committee? So several of us put in our resumes, and they rejected all of us and only nominated the incumbents again, so there was an uncompetitive election. So we put forward a resolution from the floor, essentially instructing the nominating committee next time around to behave like a committee on candidates. And so I just got a letter last week from the CEO of the credit union saying, we consulted a lawyer, and the assembled members don't have the power to instruct the nominating committee to do anything. So we're going to do what we're going to do, and we're not legally bound by this. But again, now he's in a position where if they don't allow a competitive election, suddenly you have 400 members who clearly voted by a 2-to-1 margin for competitive elections, who they're essentially giving the middle finger to. And that then further legitimizes the dissident faction and proves the point that, okay, so we're just, if they ignore the will of the people as democratically expressed, how do they really deserve the legitimacy that comes with that democracy? And that mantle then, the mantle of who is legitimized by democracy, then moves from the existing leadership to the dissident faction. But it's something that's like, you can tell people is one thing, but it's another thing to actually have the behavior of the leadership when pushed into a corner where they're given the choice to behave democratically or lose your power, or behave undemocratically or lose your power, and they behave undemocratically. That's the moment at which that transition of legitimacy can happen.
So when you talk about dissident faction, are you able to actually build an organization of members? Do you have like a list of people who signed petitions or in some way have signed on with some level of agreement about changing the credit union?
So when we were collecting petitions the first year, we had the option for people to give them their emails, and we got about 50 or 60 out of the 400 signatures we collected gave us their emails. And it's also been something with just the people who've been involved, touching bases within their social network and figuring out, because it's such, your credit union membership is such a marginal part of most people's identity that people don't think your best friend could be a member of the same credit union, and you don't know unless they happen to pay for dinner with their debit card, and you're like, oh, you're a member of Vermont Federal too? Oh, well, let me tell you that. So kind of both in terms of the people who are committed and interested in this, each of them sort of finding out who in their community is also a member, mapping that out, and putting, and then sort of really putting that annual meeting on the agenda, and being like, hey, you really need to come, it's really important, and inviting those who are interested in actually being involved to talk about putting together a platform, about what things we want to see changed. But in our experience at Vermont Federal, again, the leadership has been pretty much actively repressive to organizing efforts. Wouldn't give us any access to the membership list, obviously. But they also actually, when we had this long argument over whether or not we were originally called Vermont Federal Credit Union Members Assembly. That was the name. And they actually threatened us with legal action because they hold the trademark to Vermont Federal Credit Union. So if our group was not allowed to use the words Vermont Federal Credit Union in our name,
wow,
despite the fact that we're in a group that is exclusively made up of Vermont Federal members. So, and actually, sort of afterwards, after the first annual meeting, CEO called me and informed me that they had not only filed for trademark, filed Vermont, which is illegal, you can't, because we were notoriously using it, that you couldn't actually do this, but they had filed for trademark not only for that name, but for about a dozen other variations of that name, to essentially deny us the ability to legally use these names to organize. So wow. It was something where they really kind of recognized that there's this potential for building this collective power, but as long as you can kind of keep the cooperative members atomized and not sort of understanding that that the cooperative is a place to do politics, then they're safe. As soon as you start networking the members together and saying, hey, we want this, we have the legal power to do this, hey, the democracy, this is supposed to be democratic, but if we pass a resolution, it's toothless, and there's never competitive elections. Is this really democracy? Do we want democracy? Yeah, democracy's good. We want democracy. All right, so where do we go from here? If it's not democracy right now.
So it sounds like management really didn't even try to, wasn't even trying to pretend that they were welcoming or democratic in any way. That sounds pretty. Sounds like a pretty heavy-handed tactic. They must not have been too afraid of social pressure.
No, I mean, that's the sort of interesting thing, is that really the track of this it's this degeneration, I think, and is that they at that time no longer felt like they needed to have a power base within the membership of the credit union. They were in this comfortable self-perpetuating thing in which they hadn't had a competitive election in living memory. So who would they be embarrassed to? The only people whose opinions mattered were the people who are already on the board. And so we were challenging that, and we got the newspaper involved at one point. It got very sort of public, and I think I think there's an interesting kind of dynamic, which is essentially the CEO had a background in banking, not in cooperative. So he was used to sort of the power dynamics of, okay, I'm at the top of the pyramid and everyone's below me and kowtows to me and does what I tell them to. And suddenly you have someone who's a member, customer, lowest of the low, coming up and essentially like treating, behaving like they're kind of your boss and that they have the right to dictate things to you. You're not the one who has the right to dictate things to them. Like, he got furious sometimes. Like, and he actually, like, at the last annual meeting, like, had to be pulled away from the podium after the vote when they lost, and they were clearly not expecting to lose that vote. He was like yelling at members who were bringing up questions who we had never met before, like the group that was organizing. But there's people who are like, yeah, this is kind of fishy, or this is kind of weird, and he was saying like, well, there's I remember one woman in particular, my partner just looked at me and was just like, he's yelling at that woman. Like, this is not talking, he's just talking down to her. And so, kind of getting them, these people, one of these weaknesses, I think, is that people who are used to being autocrats, their skill set is very different from people who are skilled at existing in a democratic, accountable environment. And so, they continue to behave like autocrats, and that hurts them because their legitimacy is based on democracy. And so, if you can really sort of highlight the gulf between their behavior and their personality and the actual values of the organization, that can be a place to insert a wedge and have that really be a source of power.
So Matt, it sounds like a lot of what you have to deal with, or what you have been dealing with, is what I deal with every day as a union organizer. And even though there are quote-unquote regulations to ensure these types of things don't happen, they're just not enforced. I do have, the only experience I really have with a co-op in organizing was out in Oregon, an electric co-op, which was probably one of the worst anti-union campaigns I've seen. We didn't even get to filing for an election, the threats of termination and whatnot. So it's not just, the internal democracy for the people who are part of the co-op, it's also for the employees. In Vermont, in your experience, are there any organized, worker-organized, unions in co-ops?
I mean, the two most prominent food co-ops in northern Vermont are both organized through the UE, which is, I don't know if you're familiar with them, but they're, it's a small union. I think there's a total of like 30,000 or so members, very democratic, kind of when thinking about unions. And so they, there's definitely, I know the co-op in Montpelier, out Matt's way, had a somewhat contentious bargaining contract last time around. But on the flip side, I know that at City Market in Burlington, there's actually a specifically progressive slate that ran in the late 90s. Sort of a group that one of their reasons for running was to sort of help facilitate the institution of a union at City Market. And so there's a pro-union majority, I believe, on the board of City Market, sort of at the time when the organizing was happening, which obviously was pretty helpful to the process. And I think it's, in terms of credit unions, I know very few. I can't actually think of one that is specifically unionized, but I think that, you know, as I kind of mentioned briefly before, I think that in terms of the employees being one of the power bases for management, I think for combining a union organizing campaign with a sort of campaign for general democracy, sort of having an alliance between workers and rank and file sort of members against this kind of management capture and management sort of pulling in all the power to itself, could be a very fruitful kind of alliance that would make this process that much easier, because management doesn't have that captured employee base as sort of a bulwark against sort of pro-democracy organizing.
Yeah, often in the campaigns, the board of directors, even in a for-profit company or a non-profit, it is a target. You have to change them or threaten them in some way for the workers to get the power. So I can understand how these two groups, those trying to get more democracy in a co-op and the workers, would be natural allies.
Mm-hmm. I mean, and again, there's the tension that I mentioned earlier, always between consumers wanting lower prices and workers wanting higher wages. But kind of finding the way to like hit the right balance and sort of mediate that to the best of its ability. I think that's something where neither side's going to be really happy if, in fact, management is capturing whatever surplus is happening to pay themselves higher wages and, go along with their own petty empire building and hiring their friends to cushy jobs, etc. Which is kind of the nest feathering that happens when management sets the prerogatives for an organization. Eliminating that means there's more resources for both groups.
Well, it's not always about money either. Sometimes it's about respect. And that can be a powerful motivator for a lot of people. When you go home at night after a day of work and you're just completely frustrated with life, having a union can make a difference. And, and it's not always about money.
Well, without a union, you're in a situation where you can't even have that discussion. Do we have any surplus? Profits, or is it going to management? Is it going to low prices? Or is it possible to have a raise? It's like these are questions that don't even get asked.
Right.
Exactly.
Wait, wouldn't all unions be worker-run cooperatives too? Wouldn't they be worker cooperatives too, or are they how are the employees chosen in a cooperative?
In terms of worker co-ops, you have essentially this situation where there are some unionized worker co-ops, but that's usually a political choice. I know in Burlington there's one called WebSkillet that's organized through the UE, and one of the founders was like the UE organizer before he founded WebSkillet. He has a kind of ideological loyalty to UE. But a lot of time you'll have worker co-ops that are not union shops, because there's more of an inward focus, and there's not a sense of, okay, we need to be connected to other unions. That there's the sense that their ownership is what kind of provides the power relations, that unionization is another way of seeking similar power relations. So there's, I can actually, I'll find one of the guys from WebSkillet wrote a little piece on why their worker co-op chose to be a union co-op, but within the worker co-op world, there's definitely some heated debates around kind of the usefulness of a worker co-op being also a unionized workplace.
I know when I lived in Amherst, Massachusetts, there's a co-op called Collective Copies, which was actually a regular, I believe, originally organized as a traditional capitalist copy shop where students would go in and make photocopies. It's kind of a college town, small college town, and there was a union organizing drive. I believe actually the union organizing drive drove the boss out entirely, and that's how it became a cooperative. I'm pretty sure that's the history of it, but they maintain an affiliation with UE, and if you get printing done there, you can ask to get the union bug on whatever is being printed, and at least with printing and photocopying, a lot of progressive institutions will look for the little, the union, what they call a union bug, like a little decal that shows that it's made with union labor to, because I guess is a, so it's, I guess with the co-ops maybe there isn't that tradition, but it's kind of just to signify that the labor was, it was done with labor that's being fairly treated, not exploited labor.
Actually, just to be able to have a union bug would be a good reason, period. A lot of times unions and even politicians, in some circumstances, won't have anything published or printed, unless it has a union bug on it. So I can see that as being a reason for wanting to have a worker-owned co-op, to be a union also.
Sure. Yeah, even this like signs for politicians, like bumper stickers. A lot of, especially like city elections, a lot of cities' politics are driven more so by unions. The bumper stickers will have the union bug on them.
And there's the interest. One of those other interesting kind of union connections. I know there's been. Off and on, kind of see little bits of news and press releases about United Steelworkers connecting with Mondragon and looking at sort of the union starting to putting resources towards the formation of worker co-ops. So that's kind of another piece of it where, again, like, and especially for worker co-ops, even more than for consumer co-ops, the source of capital is a huge issue, and saying, okay, well, union resources being devoted to sort of forming sort of worker co-op-owned enterprises would be kind of another way to have that kind of unionized worker co-op thing happen. Although you can oftentimes, there's an organizational dynamic where you'll have a founding organization and create sort of a spin-off organization, and over time the loyalty of the latter to the former will decay as time and sort of the relationships become more distant. So that's always something to consider.
So let's say Matt or I are part of a co-op, for a, like you were talking about the credit unions, and we wanted to try to do some of the things you're doing. Are there resources online, or are there books, or what are the resources to learn more about how to move forward?
I mean, there's really not a huge amount out there. Like, we had to sort of, we had to even fight to get them to put the bylaws of our credit union on the website. That took a little doing. But there's really sort of, especially like in terms of credit unions and activism, the last 30, 40 years have been kind of almost a dead period. So there's been very little that's gone on. I mean, in terms of kind of like the next steps for a campaign like that, would be sort of getting a copy of the bylaws just to make sure you know the rules of the road before you go in. So know when they're breaking those rules, and then sort of scouting out, and particularly if you're kind of looking for an institution that would be most kind of the idea being like initially when we were starting this campaign, we were like, okay, like we'll get a bunch of people together, figure out what co-op everyone or what credit union everyone's part of, and then we'll like launch simultaneous campaigns at a bunch of credit unions. We quickly realized it made in terms of the manpower we had, it made a lot more sense to sort of pick one credit union, have the people who weren't members of that credit union yet join the credit union, almost like a salting type thing, and then and then say, okay, like this is the particular one where we're going to put all of our energy into, rather than sort of spreading out. And so once you found that, a few things to sort of look at would be, looking at the democratic process. Obviously, in terms of a group wanting to revive democracy, finding the organization where democracy seems the weakest. So if there's one that has a fairly working open system, maybe like that's it. Putting your energy there versus putting your energy at one where things are really in crisis, but also where because democracy is decayed, the existing board doesn't actually have a power base to draw on to defend their position, or it has a fairly minimal one. So that if you can organize well enough, the balance of power can tip your way. And then also looking for potential self-dealing and other things. Again, sort of like what's going to delegitimize the existing leadership that hasn't cultivated democracy, and say, all right, like what looks like the least legitimate leadership, and then go after that. And there's some stuff, if you're interested, I can send. Like there's a few blog posts that have kind of narratives of different pieces of this that we've put out, our little group has put out over the past couple of years, and we're kind of looking forward and kind of waiting for the final decision to see whether there will be a competitive election or not. And it's a slow process too, because usually like about a third of the board goes up for election each year. So even if you win a smashing success, you're a third of the board, you're not the whole board. But there's most credit unions into their bylaws have kind of a nuclear option built in. Different ones have different requirements, but a pretty standard one is that if you can get 500 member signatures, you can call a special meeting that basically is empowered to do anything. So if you have kind of a long train of abuses in which the leadership continues to delegitimize itself further and further, then you can potentially sort of call for a meeting to remove the full incumbent board and elect a new one from the floor. And obviously that's a pretty, that's something that while it's awesome to have that power, that most rank and file members aren't going to sign on to that unless you have pretty clear evidence that the existing leadership has consistently and repeatedly and systematically undermined democracy at the organization. And then once you have that evidence built up, then you can say, all right, now it's time to go, and use that nuclear option. But I think, and the hope is that I know several other groups around the country that are in the planning stages for this sort of strategy, and the hope is that if it starts to become clear that this is happening in more and more places, a lot of these democratic things that we want to see implemented, it won't come to that, and it will become clear that if you don't want trouble, you need to start respecting democracy. Hopefully, we'll see.
So you never tried schmoozing your way onto the board? That wasn't considered an option? You didn't try pretending like you were pro-management to just get on the board? Because I imagine these elections are, sometimes these co-ops really are desperate to put bodies on these boards, not thinking that they're actually going to do anything.
Well, I think I would be very interested to see sort of, I think that could be a valid strategy if you're coming in quietly. We sort of came in under the assumption when we saw like 20 signatures initially that it was almost like a honeypot in a way, where it was something where we were like, oh, like yeah, that's easy enough. And having had the experience in my food co-op where they're pretty inviting, having candidates on the ballot, we sort of went in with the naive assumption that there was a respect for democracy and a respect for the process. But when the first day that people were out collecting signatures, the CEO came down from his office several floors up and like spent an hour basically arguing that it was disrespectful for people to be collecting signatures and running, because that was them disrespecting him personally. Because why were you running if you must think they're awful? The credit union's running, like nobody runs. So kind of like encountering that was really like whoa, this is a very different culture than our food co-op. I think that there definitely are credit unions out there where you have a leadership where they're not really conscious of the democratic thing, but they're not opposed to it, and you can make the argument rationally, hey, it's better for the organization, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But I think there's also a lot of people who are in these leadership roles for whom they recognize that what democracy functionally means is that their autonomy and their power is constrained. You're transferring power from them to the rank and file members, and people who like power don't like to give up power. So, you're going to have these. I think, unfortunately, there will be a lot. If the way in a lot of these organizations that democracy will be revived is through a certain level of conflict.
Well, does anybody else have any questions? Maybe we should wrap things up. I wish Scott had been able to be on the call and talk about his work in Brazil. When we originally were planning this, I think we had the thought that we'd talk about union organizing too, and then I think it rather quickly became clear that both of those topics, unions and co-ops, are easily big enough to be a conversation in and of themselves. So we haven't scheduled another follow-up, but I think we probably will want to have more conversations about strategies for building worker power, and this is, I think, just one angle to approach that question. So I set up this Google chat with my personal Google Plus account, but next time I'll be sure to set up the event with RevUnity's Google Plus page, so people can and hopefully people can add that to their circles and get into the conversation. Because I think some people had technical. I think some people may have had technical problems with getting on.
We'll get better every time, Matthew.
I hope so. I hope we get better.
It's not a Google Hangout unless you have at least 15 minutes of tech issues.
Matt, you said you train people how to use Google Hangout in addition to everything else that you do?
Yeah, that's my day job, is either people who've just gotten out of prison or have been previously homeless and recently housed. I set them up with recycled computers and teach them how to do this amongst other things.
Oh, wow.
So
well, I don't think
it's a pretty fun job.
Running Windows or Linux?
Well, we've been using XP for a while, but I've been transitioning people over to Ubuntu.
Very good, because XP
especially with
is
old hardware is you got a gig of RAM's you're golden, whereas most other modern operating systems, that's like pocket calculator style.
Yeah, so our website is currently down as well. We were just about to transfer it over to a new host because our internet service provider was gone AWOL on us. And we have a new provider set up, so hopefully shortly we'll be relaunching our blog, which is revunity.org. And so that's one place people can check out. We'll be posting probably this video and other things. So let's. I look forward to keeping up the conversation about co-ops, though. I think it's certainly inspired a lot of conversation, even beyond tonight. I think in our group. So I think this is an angle to look at. I think a lot of it depends on where you are in the economy. If you're in a position to do union organizing or you're in a position to do co-op organizing, it's not necessarily that there's a right or wrong choice, but based on where you where you are to be able to see opportunities to organize.
Okay, well, thank you so much for having me tonight.
Thanks for calling in.
Thanks, Matt.
All right, well, you all have a good evening.
All right, comrades. I'm going to end the broadcast. Thanks for watching.